Okay, so that should be good. So hopefully this is recording. If it's not recording, no, yeah, it should be recording. So if you're watching this in the future, you'll notice that no one is watching my stream right now, but that's okay. I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. Maybe people will join, maybe they won't. If nothing else, I just wanted a video to show up on my channel when people showed up. Okay. So, let me turn this music down. So pretty much this is my first stream trying to do something kind of focused. So what I'm focusing in on today is kind of making up some biology, looking at some media that I really like, and sort of trying to figure out whether or not anything in it could be biologically possible. So I have a bachelor's degree in biology and a PhD in biochemistry. So I love biology, and I also love sci-fi, and honestly, I love sci-fi when it gets biology wrong, not to make fun of it, but instead because I like to try and think about how, well, biology is this really broad, really squishy topic. I want to think about how maybe stuff like that can actually work in real life, or at least works within the universe that we are given. So today, what I wanted to look at was one of my favorite TV shows back in the day, and still now, which is Stargate Atlantis, the spin-off show to Stargate SG-1, which itself has a bunch of its own biological interesting topics in biology. There's some weird stuff going on there, some stuff that is definitely not possible, but some other stuff that I'm probably going to get to someday. But I'm honestly just kind of taking the easy route today to talk about what I think are the best villains in the series. And out of the villains of this particular series. So, Stargate Atlantis takes place a couple years after the United States has started sending people off through an alien device called the Stargate, which makes wormholes, letting them go to all these different planets that all look like Vancouver, because that's where it was shot. And eventually they find a way to get to another galaxy that was once populated by a very advanced species of aliens called the Ancients, who built things like this floating city of Atlantis. But they very quickly find out that those people are long gone, primarily because of the main villains of the series. So the main villains are these guys, the Wraith. They have this interesting vampire-like sort of air to them. They're really mysterious. They always wear dark leather, and they have these feeding hands. So on the right palm, they have this little mouth-looking thing that kind of opens up, and the way that they feed is by absorbing the life force out of humans. So in the series, their main prey are humans, so they go through the Stargates in this other galaxy, and they try to suck up as much life force as they can in these cullings. So they don't breed humans, they don't cultivate humans. They kind of just let these primitive groups of primitive people sort of propagate on their own. And every couple hundred years, it sounds like, or maybe every couple decades, they come through, sweep up a bunch to take back to their hives and to feed before going to sleep for a little while longer. So, one of the interesting things, at least in the show, about these Wraith is that they collect, their collectives are referred to as hives. So primarily we see a lot of male characters, but every once in a while there is a queen. So a queen wraith will show up, and she will always be the most powerful wraith on the ships. All the other wraiths seem to defer to her. It seems like the only characters who can really tell a wraith queen what to do are other queens. So there's this societal structure that the writers put into this show, in trying to like figure out what these aliens are or what these aliens were. So something that comes out in the show, and something that they kind of struggle with in a novel that I didn't read, but I read the summary of, and then I'm going to kind of ignore, is the origin of the Wraith. So they surmise in universe that the Wraith are descended from this type of parasitic insect that they encounter a couple times throughout the series, called the Eratus bug. So very much like a Wraith, it latches on to a living human to absorb the life force, whatever that means, out of the human, sustaining it, and then rendering the human dead. These insects are said to share a lot of DNA similarities as the Wraith, but the Wraith also share similarities with humans. So, maybe they're, at least in the show, they hypothesize that over many generations of feeding on humans as a primary source, some of these insects began to take on more anthropomorphoid type characteristics, eventually becoming the bipedal, 10 fingers, 10 toes, humanoid-like aliens that we see throughout the rest of the series. So I think that's kind of wrong. I feel like, although it's not quite hinted at one way or the other, at least if we were to surmise maybe how this might happen based on some other evidence, that maybe it was sort of the reverse. Maybe over a certain amount of time, humans who were being fed upon by Eratus bugs were sort of surviving, and from the exchange of whatever life force means, gaining some of the characteristics of the bugs. But maybe that'll be for a different time. So we have these bugs. There's also some other weird things about Wraith biology. They seem to be basically immortal. The only way they seem to be able to die of natural causes is simply by starving to death, and even that takes a very, very long time. They can go into periods of hibernation. One thing that is very briefly touched on in one episode, and in the only episode that we see an immature Wraith, is when we meet this particular female Wraith who was found in a crashed ship by a human and then raised. Apparently, prior to puberty, they seem to be much more human-like. So her skin is far less pallid. She was said to have sustained completely on food, which is something that the Wraith have specifically said that they cannot do, at least as adults. The point of this episode is, well, actually, she at some point had to start feeding on the life force of others, but that's a whole nother thing. But what that kind of suggests is that they don't even start life out quite like a Wraith. So to me, at least, that's a little bit more evidence that maybe perhaps their origin is much more on the human side than the Eratus bug side, but I don't really know for sure. In fact, to preface everything, I don't know anything for sure in terms of what I was going to talk about for the stream today, because all of it's just for some fun, just making up what maybe we can see as real biology, but to be honest, it's all just kind of based on what I know, but then made up from there to sort of fill in the gaps. So the thing that I was most interested in is sort of thinking about and figuring out how exactly Wraith procreate, how their social structure is put together. So as I sort of mentioned, primarily most of the Wraith seem to be male, or at least present as male, or what we think of as male. There's a very small number of queens that we meet. So these are very clearly female. They don't quite say if they lay eggs or give live birth, but they're described as providing the genetic material for all other Wraith. And beyond these two, there's also another class that I didn't look up. So there's this other class of Wraith who seem to be much more numerous than the ones without the face shield. These are kind of like the soldiers or the warriors of the group. They don't seem to ever talk. They only seem to ever take orders. And later on, we find out that a large majority of these seem to have been created via some cloning method, taking what a queen was giving off for genetic material and cloning that to create a massive army to defeat the ancient aliens who are long since gone. So, anyways, we have this kind of weird social structure that doesn't seem at all like a human social structure. So what I kind of want to sort of try and draw out and piece through is exactly what might be going on here, but from a genetic standpoint, right? So thinking about what we know about the genetics of certain organisms here on Earth, and maybe seeing what we can decide makes the most sense for the Wraith. So really obviously at the start, we can talk about, if I can get this working. So we have humans in my really bad handwriting. So obviously when we think about humans, we have males, we have females, and we exist at about a 50-50. Right, so on average, very, very roughly, there's about 50% males, 50% females, right? We've got some other things to think about. So something I'll talk about in a second. If we think about flies, they also exist at about a 50-50. But then we get to something that's maybe a little bit more relevant for figuring out what exactly the Wraith are up to in terms of their genetics. And that is bees. So, right, we talk about bees as having queens, they have hives, similar words that we use for the Wraith. So for bees, about 99% of all of the bees are female, with about 1%, maybe a little bit less, being male, and just a single, so I'll put less than 1% because there's a lot of bees, being sort of a special class of female, which is a queen. So I'll just denote that like this. Right, so they already have a social structure that maybe looks a little bit more similar to what we see in the Wraith, except obviously, like I said, in the Wraith, the only females we see are queens. So the Wraith gender structure, as in terms of percentages, it's kind of hard to tell, but let's say greater than 95% are male. We don't seem to see any non-queens, so just put that at probably 0. And then we also have, the queens represent whatever that 100 minus the males are. So assuming it might be actually closer to 99%, we'll just say about 1%. I know that doesn't add up to 100, but that's more or less what it is, or at least via the show seems to be what we see. So already, the Wraith don't look anything like humans or flies, and there's a reason why I put them both down. Nor do they look like bees, since most of the workers are female. So what I want to sort of show is that in large part this is due to, not in large part, this is completely due on Earth, for the animals that we care about, for this example, for sex chromosomes. So every single cell in a body has DNA. For complex organisms, that DNA is organized into several chromosomes that are tightly wound around a protein scaffolding that provides both structure and information. And in order to reproduce, we separate chromosomes that we received from the male parent and the female parent, kind of mix them together, and then spit them back out piecemeal to combine with another organisms. So in humans, we think about this in terms of X and Y chromosomes, giving the male-female ratios. So males are XY, females are XX. This is actually the same in flies, which is why I wanted to point out flies. So male flies are XY, female flies are XX. So these work about the same. But something kind of interesting that I'll get to a little bit now is, like, even though they look almost the same in terms of this, they're dealing with those extra chromosomes in really different ways. But let's skip that for now and talk about these bees. So for the most part, queen bees and normal bees, they're both XX. They actually are not necessarily different on the DNA level. They actually have the same DNA, the same sort of chromosomal structure, whether it's a queen, which is much bigger than a worker bee, but also has all these developmental changes to it that allows her to pump out all these eggs. I believe the normal workers, in at least honeybees, are completely sterile. They don't mate whatsoever. But interestingly, the males end up being just one X. So X or X naught. So they don't have a Y chromosome at all, or an equivalent. They simply have half the DNA content of either of the two females. The way you get a queen, though, just for reference, is that you feed the larva when it's growing up something called royal jelly. I didn't read up on it. I think it has certain metabolites in it that cause a series of epigenetic changes, which control the expression and repression of certain genes in the genome. Very complicated, but basically you give it some special jelly and you get a queen out of it. So I have some ideas on the Wraith, but I'm going to skip that for now. One thing to talk about quick, though. Hello, small dog party. Welcome. One thing what I wanted to mention, though, with humans and flies, and why I mentioned both of them, is kind of this hey, what's up? This interesting phenomenon that we have here. Small dog, you definitely missed it, but we're talking about the Wraith from Stargate, if you're not familiar. And by we, I mean me. So in humans and mammals, we have this problem, right? We don't like our chromosomes to be unequal. If we look at the other chromosomes, so we have a bunch of other chromosomes. Whether you're male or female, you have, for chromosome 1, you have one of them, two of them. For chromosome 2, you have one of them, two of them. All the way down, if you're a female, you have two X chromosomes. Great. Everything lines up nice and even. You have equal numbers. That's really important for certain processes. But unfortunately for males, you end up with, so let's do a male. If you talk about chromosome X, you have one, but you're missing one. And you have this extra chromosome lying around. So we have this kind of disjointed, like this difference between the chromosomal numbers, which could be fine. But nature decided to try and figure out a way to solve like any problems with that, because nature likes to be rather efficient if it can. So what we do as mammals, come on, if I can get drawing again, is in males, we consider both of our chromosomes, X and Y, as sort of, equal amounts of sort of product comes out of them. But if you are female, you keep one, and in every single one of your cells, you kind of compress the other one. So ultimately, if you look at both of them, even though there's an extra Y right here, in the males, they each have one X. Effectively, there's effectively one X chromosome in each of them. Flies do something kind of different. So the females keep both X's around. So that means that there's, roughly 2 amount of stuff coming from them. So that's usually proteins. What the males simply do is they just double the amount of everything that comes off of their X. So you also get roughly 2 out of your X. So let me get rid of these. So a really easy way to not remember. Let me get rid of this quick. No. So one way that this kind of, all comes down, how this bores down, is that we can see this in Calico Cats. So let me get rid of this. Go to a new page. Yeah. Okay. So I'm pretty sure most people have seen a calico cat at some point or another. So a calico cat is, it's cats with spots, basically. Most calico cats are actually female, and there's a reason for that. So in cats, it just so happens that there is a gene that encodes for coat color that's on the X. So, for example, you have 2 male cats, and in one of the male cats, you will have on that X a black gene, and on the other male cat, on the X chromosome, you will have a orange gene. And what that ends up being is, out of this, you get an orange cat. I'm not going to draw a cat. Out of this other one, you'll get a black cat. Right, cool. So that's great. That's all good. But, I said that this presents a problem for females. So this is the male case, right? But if we talk about females, we have XX, right? If we have an XX with 2 Bs, well, that's just a black cat. If we have an XX with 2 oranges, well, that's probably an orange cat. But what happens if we have the case where we have one X that has the orange gene, and then the other X has the, I did this backwards. One X has the black gene and one X has the orange gene. Well, as this thing is developing, the cat, that is, let's assume this is, the first cell in the embryo. It's an awful cell. As it divides and develops to make a cat, different groups of cells start doing different things. So, right, remember in mammals, one of the 2 X's is inactivated. So, one half of the cat will have this X with the black gene, and the other X chromosome is just kind of set aside. It doesn't do anything whatsoever. Meanwhile, in the other half of the cat, you might get the case where the other X chromosome with that orange gene is hanging out, and it's making all of its proteins and everything that you need to make a cat, and you turn off the other one. couple more divisions later, and I'm not going to be able to draw this. But, you know, I'll just draw a blob. You end up with a calico cat, a cat that has multiple different colors, multiple spots. So that's just something that we do to like consider when thinking about like, okay, well, what could happen with an alien race like the Wraith? Let's turn that off. Come on. Okay. Sorry, this is a new setup, so I'm finagling everything on the fly. All right. So now we're back to the Wraith, right? So they're doing something really weird. And this is just kind of based off of the societal structure that I'm kind of making this up as I go, right? So we just sort of made a difference between, you know, humans and flies doing similar things, but they come to the same outcome, but they're doing slightly different things. Mammals are doing this whole X inactivation thing. Flies are just doubling the amount of X in the female, or excuse me, the male. Bees are kind of cool. So the reason, maybe not the reason, but the effect of what they do is that if you have a queen, so there's your XX with a crown, you know, she's being tended to by these workers who are feeding her honey and, you know, keeping her safe and everything. Unfortunately, there is no chance to mate, right? Bees are cool. Bees are kind of cool. So they don't really have a chance to mate. In all organisms, we go through this process called meiosis, which separates out our cells into a special type of cells called gametes, and that makes eggs and sperm. Unfortunately, for most organisms who sexually reproduce, what you get out of this are effectively haploids. So they are cells with only one copy of everything. So this female can only make these four gametes, these four bees. If we go back to the humans, you know, male humans, we produce sperm that make either Y or X. Females make X and X gametes. You combine those together and you can either get, let's get rid of that. You can either get XX or XY. So that's how you get new generations, right? You're just combining these what are called haploid cells together. Okay, so but you're in this bee case, right? And something's wrong. You don't have any males to speak of. What bees do is something really clever. These gametes, if they aren't fertilized, so these eggs, if there wasn't a male around, what they do is they just become males. So each one of these, if they're not fertilized, they become males. These males are all haploid, meaning they have half the amount of DNA as any of the female bees. They go off, fly off to find a female to mate with. And that new queen that they will then mate with. Let's see. Sorry, I'm reading chat as I'm writing this. That male will go mate with that female queen, combine together, and what you'll get are a bunch more XX females, one of whom is going to be chosen to be the new queen of a new hive, and all the rest. Oh, thank you, Derek, for following me. And all the rest will go off to be worker bees. Small Dog says, human chromosomes are really interesting. I didn't know we had so many chromosome abnormalities until recently. Yeah, so that is a whole field of study. Some of those abnormalities happen and cause, uh, I wouldn't say mild disease, but one chromosomal abnormality is trisomy 21. Trisomy 21 causes Down syndrome. That's just where you get an extra chromosome of one. Maybe something that's more deadly to someone who might seem otherwise, neurotypical is when you get chromosomal translocations. So that's when you get one chromosome that's, happy and living over here. This other chromosome over here, they kind of do a little dance and accidentally combine a little bit. And unfortunately, sometimes at that site where they combine in the middle, you can create a whole new gene, which can end up causing a type of cancer. So I know there's Derek can tell me how many types of cancer are created by that. But yeah, it's not great. All right. I got to get rid of this. Hundreds of types of cancer. So that's a long-winded explanation for, what bees are up to. Whoops. And as soon as I erase all this, I still haven't gotten to the Wraith. I'm giving a lot of setup before talking about what I think is going on with the Wraith. And there's a reason for that. It's because of those numbers, right? It doesn't seem like it makes much sense, to me at least, that they're not getting females out of this if they're doing the same thing as bees. So, but I think they are doing something similar. I think they're doing something insecty here. So people can disagree with me if you want, but I have to check my notes to make sure I'm doing this right. Yeah, so I think the Wraith have something like, the females, which are few and far in between, have something like an XX, right? Two X's. Instead of this other class of females, they don't have that. They have two classes of males. So we will do, we'll call them the warriors. And then they're always scientists. They're kind of commanders. So that 95% is, mostly those warriors and some of those commanders. So these warriors are a lot like the female bees, but they seem to present male. The commanders too seem to present male, and they're not as useless as a bee male. And they actually seem to be, sitting around doing things, defending the hive, doing scientific experiments, stuff like that. So what I propose is going on is that a subset of these males has a haploid set of chromosomes, at least for the sex chromosomes, and the other ones do not. So what I think is going on is that these commander guys, they have sort of like an XY, but I'm thinking the Y more like a fertility thing. Where that Y chromosome kind of gives them a little something extra special, which seems to be why they have personality. They kind of go off and do their own thing. They can change allegiances. Meanwhile, I think the warriors are very similar to those B haploid males. So there's just an X, right? So I think the reason, my evidence for this, is that in one episode we encounter a queen. So remember, XX is the queen. She is hooked up to some kind of machine that is taking in genetic material that she's giving off and creating, with the help of technology, many drones. And it doesn't seem to reference any sort of mating. Chaim Paul maybe says, it's super interesting. I bet Dr. Carson studied a lot of this when he was developing the retrovirus. Yeah, so I have some opinions about that retrovirus, but I'll talk about that after I finish this. I I feel like the way it was written, it was convenient for the Wraith to be descendants of that Erratus bug, but I think in actuality, it maybe makes more sense that they are some sort of human descendants. But we'll talk about that. Anyways, so you got a queen sitting around. She gives off basically like gangbusters, all these warriors, right? That might help account for why they seem to be so pervasive. And it kind of makes sense the way that the Wraith social structure seems to be worked out, where every hive ship is usually its own contained thing. Every once in a while, one of them will have a queen. That queen seems to be pretty important, and I can see how that's maybe really important, because if you want more soldiers, you have to have a queen who hasn't mated in a while, just kind of pumping out these warrior babies. But anyways, but then you have this other class of male who is XY, right? And when they mate with queens, what I'm proposing is that's how you get more queens. That's how you get more of this second class of male. And I'm kind of legitimizing this because, if we consider the Y not really as important as it is in like humans or mammals, again, that's why I call it a fertility factor. The way you might designate male versus female is just that a male equals 1x without any of that dosage compensation that I was talking about before, with the humans turning off an X, the flies turning on an X. Meanwhile, the female, the queen, is just 2 X's. And basically, if you kind of sort through the chromosomes, do that math, that's how you determine what you are and whether or not you are kind of they never clarify if they're stupid, but they certainly never talk. But one of these sort of warrior class Wraith is whether or not you have a Y. Maybe the Y has like smart male genes in it, or something like that. Anyway, so that's how I think that the Wraith at least are genetically working. If this event, the mating is fairly rare because of their social structure, then maybe that's why we just don't see very many. So Ford became half Wraith after a few days, connected to a Wraith warrior. Imagine having a bug attached to you, say, for a year. Yeah, so I think there was something about he had the Wraith enzymes being pumped into his body. So those Wraith enzymes, those are... Oh, there was a Calico Cat, for example, from what I was talking about before. I have it somewhere. Yeah. So they were describing in that, the feeding mechanism is also interesting. So that's all the thoughts I had about on their genetics. The feeding thing is a whole other thing, is a whole other area that we can talk about. So Ford, what they said is that he had some sort of like enzyme pumped into his body. That enzyme, as they described it, was preparing the body, making the human stronger, so they wouldn't immediately die, probably from shock after having the life force sucked out of them. But yeah, having an insect attached to you for a year would probably be pretty bad too. But yeah, let's talk about that then. Didn't necessarily have to write anything down. Yeah, so how the Wraiths show up, or how they like develop. In the show, repeatedly they talk about how they think the like Erratus bug attached itself to humans, and over time they absorbed more of the human-like qualities. But that kind of, I've never been satisfied with that answer. Actually, let me go back. Prepared. So I don't see how that insect thing, if it was like even a quarter human, which I'm imagining is like a very small, very like baby looking insect humanoid. I don't understand how that would continue to get human prey up until some plateau where for some reason it's basically a human. It also doesn't really explain, for me at least, this character, the way she, up until puberty, could consume food and just didn't need to feed, and was even like far less pallid than the other Wraith. I mean, I don't have a biological mechanism for either direction, but the way I think makes more sense is if they were either on purpose or by the same mechanism they mentioned, but in reverse, went from humans to Wraith. So there's this book that came out that I didn't read, but I read the introduction to, where they reveal that the Wraith were an ancient experiment gone wrong. I don't like that. That book isn't written by anyone I think associated with the show, and I think it came out after the show had ended. So I'm not really considering that. But maybe you can imagine if you like that explanation. What I'm more wondering is, since we know with Ford that the Wraith are injecting something, right? There's an exchange of something between the insect, whatever it is, and the human, the food. Just wondering if that during that exchange, things can kind of go both ways. So rather than the Eratus bug taking in human qualities, it's more like the human is taking in Eratus bug qualities. To me, at least, it makes more sense for... I'm going to close this Calico Cat. It makes more sense for this little thing to start accidentally through horizontal gene transfer, giving up some of its metabolism, whatever that weird metabolism is, to humans. So maybe a short-term effect of it is a human that's a lot more robust, right? So we know that these insects are much, much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Strong. Wraith have a capacity for healing that is basically unrivaled through most of the series. I think these insects do too, these bugs. So if you can imagine a group of people who encounter these bugs and over generations, if they were receiving some sort of transfer of whatever their genetics are, slowly over time, maybe that's advantageous evolutionarily. Maybe it's advantageous for them to be more hardy. Maybe it's advantageous for their metabolisms to slow down. It seems like the Wraith have a really slow metabolism. They go through long periods of hibernation. If we want to believe my little XY sort of explanation, well, then maybe it's advantageous that, like taking over the human sex chromosome, or sex chromosome system, but then tweaking it a little bit so that the females can start to actually give birth to, more of whatever the Wraith human intermediate was, to act as like a warrior class. I'm just straining for more thoughts on this. I mean, it's just so weird that she can eat food. I know it was just part of the story and they probably just thought of that in 10 minutes. But to me, that seems like there's something going on where they are very, very, very human-like. There's also a line in the episode I just watched yesterday where there's a Wraith who he comes and sits down and enjoys food with a human. And he makes a comment about, how it, doesn't sustain me like it would you. So that makes sense. But he said something like, since we diverged, some of my kind no longer enjoy food and some of us do. And the since we diverged to me, actually, I feel like could sound like since they diverged from humans. Again, it was just a throwaway line, so I don't actually think that was really all that relevant. But I like to think that maybe it's the human first hypothesis is what I'm going to call it. So yeah. Oh, there's the warrior guys. Yeah, so these are interesting too. So that's why I think another thing about their genetics, that cloning facility kind of presents some problems. Uh, Let me see if I can find it quick. To kind of get a bunch of these guys. These are the warrior class. And to me, it doesn't make sense really that these would be a result of mating the way they had talked about it. But if that machine was doing something like supplying her body with nutrients while also like stimulating oogenesis and collecting those unfertilized eggs and then allowing them to develop in these developmental pods to basically create thousands of these warriors, and then on top of that, do some cloning because they specifically say that this is cloning. To me, at least, I feel like that's a little bit more evidence for this, for what I'm talking about. But who knows? Okay. Yeah. So, Paul, maybe. So you mentioned that retrovirus. So that's really complicated. Uh, what they say in the show always they never say enough to make that make sense. So basically, what a retrovirus, the way they talk about it is a delivery system for something, and that something has to do with genetic engineering. So the genetic engineering that they're talking about is kind of this, turning off of genes. They never really talk about it. And assuming kind of like the time that they're talking about, or excuse me, the era that this was produced, I feel like there's a couple possibilities. So when they made this show, we didn't have CRISPR, right? So unless Dr. Carson made a discovery, what would that be? Like 3 to 7 years too early, even for like the very beginning. It's probably not CRISPR. They were doing something else. So the retrovirus, what they're kind of suggesting is that they. Oh, is this going to work for me? When I hear retrovirus, at least in this case, it kind of sounds like they have a virus, which I'm not going to do a very good job of drawing. But in that retrovirus, it contains some sort of, genetic information, probably a set of genes. So they actually talk about this in using like the ancient gene therapy. So for example, like the most simple case is like that blue is the ancient gene. This virus, all it can really do is deliver that gene. So let's say that virus finds the edge of your cell. You've also got a nucleus in here that has your DNA in it. So it will kind of combine and release this new gene. Maybe this is the ancient gene. Oops. That itself will, in some way, transport into the nucleus. And in the nucleus, you have, your own DNA floating around. So lots and lots of genetic information. Now, back at the time, we knew quite a bit about, how this process might work, because the point would be that in between just some specific part of the DNA, you would get an insertion of that ancient gene. So that's now integrated into your body, right? If it's not, then it would be something way more transient and wouldn't last as long. Sort of the issue and the reason why CRISPR is at least now pretty great is this isn't really specific. It just kind of randomly would integrate depending on how they wanted to design it. So I'm still talking about the ancient gene therapy and also the Dr. Carson retroviral treatment. So it's easier to explain with one thing. So that's why we're dealing with the ancient gene. But it'd kind of suck if on this half of the chromosome was like one half of like important gene, and on this part it was the other half of the important gene. So that's why we don't really use sort of non-targeted retroviral therapies, right? They usually have to be pretty specific, and there are ways to do that. Let me just look up something quick. And when talking about the retrovirus, it's usually just all about, getting in this piece of information. What I kind of skirted by is that the retro usually means that this is like an RNA, and just the mechanism by which it's integrated into the DNA causes it to be what's called reverse transcribed into DNA. But that's just a technique sort of thing. There's ways you can sort of flank this DNA. So you can put things on either side that kind of help it find where it needs to go, for lack of a better word. Back in the mid-2000s, that's about as good as they could get. I think it would still be pretty random. I am not 100% versed on what that would have looked like, back in the day. But maybe, for one gene, totally fine. But for Carson's thing, right? Let's just assume I'm correct, and the Wraith come from humans that have like a couple Eratus bug thingies in them. A couple genes here, a couple genes there, and that's all you need to make a practically immortal vampire Wraith. This retrovirus would have to be very targeted and find those genes and either destroy them effectively or turn them off in some way. And so we can do that, I guess. So the first way that we could destroy it, actually, let me go back here. Method 1, to destroy every single Wraith gene. Basically, each of these little adapter thingies, these little guys at the ends that tell it where to go, maybe have them target a Wraith gene. And maybe you turn off enough of them to do that. If not, we can wildly speculate even further. Maybe there's some feature of a Wraith gene that just isn't present in the human genes. A certain genetic sequence, or they all are like to hang out with a certain protein or something like that. There might be a way you can just kind of get rid of all of them all at once. So I'm also guessing that at the time they were probably thinking about a technique called RNAi, or RNA interference. And that's essentially when you get a couple components together to make something that is an RNA protein complex. And then when you get a RNA in the cell, it finds it. Poly-A tail. So let's say that this is, your Wraith gene. It goes in, finds it, cuts it, and via that cutting, you've basically turned off this particular gene, right? So you kill that thing. The problem with that is then you have to find a way to make this always present. and you have to get a bunch of stuff inside the cells. And it has to be pretty constant. But sort of interestingly, we do get the hint that it is something that isn't persistent. Because if you remember, they tried this 2 or 3 times on several different Wraith, and they always seem to revert back to being Wraith. If it was this other thing where you're kind of just interrupting a gene in the genome, it wouldn't really revert back unless you did a really bad job with your design and designed something that could sort of fall out as easy as it could fall in. So I don't know, it kind of suggests that they are doing something kind of like this RNAi, where it's like transient and they didn't do a good enough job making it more permanent. Or honestly, they were just, limited by the technology of their time and just couldn't do something more permanent. We really didn't have much that was like super targeted until we had CRISPR. Even then, I don't know how you would do this with CRISPR, like turn a Wraith into a human without targeting many genes. I mean, they never, ever, ever say numbers, but it's a whole nother species that is immortal, can suck the life force out of people's bodies through a thing in their hand. I think they do this weird mating system thing that I outlined. That's got to be hundreds of genes, probably more. And once you turn them all off, that doesn't necessarily mean you're just left with a human. You're probably left with just a very, very sick and probably dead Wraith. Even though they have all they say they have all the human organs or whatever. No. I mean, humans have a broken vitamin C gene. So a gene that should help us make vitamin C inside our own bodies. But through evolutionary time, it's just broken. And so without it, and without getting vitamin C from your diet, you will eventually get scurvy and I think probably die. And that's just one gene. Besides killing off all the Wraith genes, you probably have to turn on every other metabolic gene that might still be in there, but isn't really doing much. Yeah. So Paul, if you're still around, I hope that was, I don't know if that was insightful. I hope I've explained why I have problems with that retrovirus. They keep it vague, so, they, yeah, they don't say too much to their credit. I feel like one of the reasons why I like the science that's in Atlantis and SG-1 is they kind of know when to shut up about it. They don't ever say, they don't usually say too much. They go out on a limb every once in a while, but usually they just kind of sweep it under the rug, and we trust that there's lots of scientists on their team, so then, they know what they're doing. Fiction. Yeah. But speaking of that, why didn't the Wraith just suck blood or something like that? This whole stealing life force, I mean, that's the thing I have no ideas on. I don't know exactly who in the audience has watched all of Atlantis and even given a second thought to it, but I have no idea what they're talking about when they're talking about sucking out life force. That seems like something that they thought about for the pilot of Atlantis to kind of make them scary. Probably someone in the writer's room said, oh, this is great, but they're too much like vampires. We don't want to see just vampires on TV. So we have to think of something else. So they thought of this, life force, whatever that might be. And then they kind of compounded on it. The Ford thing was kind of interesting. Putting in a bunch of enzymes. Yeah, the ancients do ascend to pure energy. But that's just fact. That's just scientific fact. That can happen. I think it must be the same force that a gold hand device attacks. Yeah, the humming and light show that gives people headaches but also makes you pass out but also reads your mind. Yeah. Yeah, so I was actually contacted by someone vague like brain energy. I mean, there are brain waves that we can measure, but that means absolutely nothing. So you're probably right. I was contacted by someone who has a more of a physicsy background. So hopefully in the future, if I continue to stream, we'll be talking about something that I don't feel comfortable talking about, like technology, and maybe he has some insights. Um, Anyways, with these these sucker things, I do like the way they talk about it with Ford, right? Um, Inserting some sort of enzyme into the body of the victim to basically loosen them up. Um, we have creatures that do that here on Earth. Those are called spiders. They some spiders inject paralytics and also digestive enzymes into living hosts. We have certain types of wasps that also inject paralytics into living hosts so that they can lay their eggs in them, and the eggs can develop in the still living creature. Eventually, it will die, but I feel like the idea is there, right? On both ends, it kind of makes sense that these wraith have a really specific mechanism for subduing biochemically their prey, and the other end they're taking something, but what that is just so vague it doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to be able to find a picture of this specifically, probably, but something that I noticed in a recent rewatch is that whenever they show someone who's been like terminally sucked dry, there's a couple things that they're like really old and wrinkly, so that's sort of one thing. So that's kind of with the life force thing. They kind of look old, but if they are very fed upon, they also dry out like a mummy. So it seems like, they are taking something that isn't just a life force. It seems like they might be actually taking something that has matter and mass. If we just kind of ignore how quickly it goes, though, I feel like we could sort of, at least in our minds, decide that it does make sense and maybe it is something. Because to be fair, our bodies are full of very useful nutrients and resources in a way. One of the main ones is water. Although it wouldn't really provide energy to any of the wraith, taking a big part of the water resources in our bodies might be one benefit for the wraith to attack humans. The other thing is we can just say that it is basically blood. If they were just sucking out the blood, that sort of could explain some of it. If you went through like extreme exsanguination, maybe your corpse would look much more deflated than if you were to die by some other means. The thing that doesn't really make sense is the premature aging. But maybe instead of aging, what they're actually seeing are the effects of some sort of digestive enzyme, right? So kind of like a spider injecting enzymes into an insect in order to sort of suck up the goop that comes out of it. Maybe the wraith are doing something similar, some selective enzymes that are breaking down certain components inside the host's or the food source's body. Why they don't consume us completely, I don't know. Maybe that has to do with the Erotis bug connection. This thing probably can't sit here and eat an entire human, so maybe they evolved in a way to sort of only take a certain portion of our bodies in order to sustain themselves, because if they stay too long, they might have to suffer from competition from other Erotis bugs, or they themselves might have predators on their home planet or something like that, right? Still, the easiest explanation is that they suck blood, or interstitial fluids or something like that, just something in the body that isn't life force. I really hate life force as a concept. The source of cellular energy is ATP. Bacteria do something similar, secreting exotoxins to rupture our cells and drink the sweet cell nectar. Yeah, no, exactly. That's why it's like this. They're almost there. They're 90% there with maybe real biology until they start uttering the word life force, life energy. And I feel like someone must have been thinking about ATP, the cellular energy that life on Earth uses, but that doesn't make sense. You can't really suck that out of a cell easily. And even if you could, there's not that much that you can do with it directly besides use it to build other storage molecules, but you need some mass for that. There's just a good chance that the Wraith are liars, that they just lie about what they're doing. Right, because if they aren't, let me think about this. Here. So, what I feel like the writers were thinking of was ATP. Paul says, oh, like the time Todd and Shepard were in a cell working together to escape, and John was constantly being fed on and then recovered over and over again, like Todd could bring him back to a normal age. Yeah, so it doesn't seem like... Oh, that does make things more difficult, though, too. Because you'd have to have some sort of mechanism. So let's just pretend for a moment that what the Wraith did is they broke down muscle tissue. Okay, well, that maybe solves some problems of how they feed, but that doesn't solve the problem of how they can put it back. That doesn't really make sense. You can't... It'd be really hard to build muscle in another organism's body. If muscle was the thing. But that's it. I didn't remember about that, but you're absolutely right. So anyways, I think the writers were probably thinking of cellular energy like ATP, like from mitochondria. Because that's the thing that I feel like everyone remembers. Mitochondria. Right? Powerhouse of the cell. So they make this ATP stuff. The thing is that in our bodies, we use this ATP in order to take small either biomolecules like organic molecules or just molecules, depending on what resources you have. We use this energy and it's spent. It's put in depleted form of ADP. And what you get out of it are large biomolecules. And those are used to build up your body, maintain homeostasis, stuff like that. And it's more or less a cycle with waste products also being produced. So we know that the Wraith, even though they can eat, they don't do it. They don't get sustenance from it. So they have to be getting this stuff from somewhere. So in a way, I'm almost thinking that the Wraith are just kind of lying a little bit. And what they're doing when they're feeding on a human is they're not just taking life force, but they're actually stealing things. So what could they be stealing? They're probably stealing a bunch of water, like we said. Thank you for the follow. Peanut Buttery. Sorry, I couldn't read that. It's too small on my screen. So they probably steal some things. They probably steal water is one thing. That's the big thing that they're stealing. They seem to breathe, so they're not stealing oxygen resources or anything like that through some weird mechanism. But like I said, their victims get dried out. They get dried out. So I'm saying that they're stealing water. They're also pumped full of enzymes, which are probably doing things more than keeping the humans alive. I think at one point Carson says that it's a mixture of different enzymes that they didn't know what it did, except for the strengthening aspect of it. But they're also going to need other things. So we know that they have DNA. So they need a nucleotide pool, and you can get nucleotides from your diet. You can also synthesize them brand new using some of that ATP. Same thing with lipids. What are we also missing? We're missing carbohydrates and protein. So actually, now that I look at it, lipids is kind of might be interesting. If you had some way to remove lipids, so that is triglycerides. So these are fat storage molecules. They kind of look like jellyfish. We also have phospholipids. These make up your cell wall. And then we also have various types of steroids. So these end up being things like hormones. And then they're completely different, and I'm not going to write them out. So maybe another way that you kind of get that old, bedraggled look is by sucking out as much lipid as you possibly can. So maybe part of what they're doing is whatever enzymes they're giving off, they don't digest muscle, they don't kill a bunch of cells, but maybe they pop lipid vessels or lipid-containing cells, so basically just fat cells. I don't know if we ever saw anyone with more body fat get fed on. I don't think so, because they always seem to just they seem to mummify, right? It seems like their skin, their bone, and then there's another layer of just dried something. Like dried muscle. So at least in my headcanon, I'm throwing lipids on the table. I don't know how. I don't know how they can suck lipids out of a being so evenly and not just sort of where they attach to. Because they also attach to a really bad spot, like right on the sternum. Even if you were going to go for like blood, that's also a pretty bad idea. Why not somewhere like closer to where like a major artery is, or just below the sternum, so you could get up to maybe like your heart a little bit easier or something? I don't know. It looks good on TV, so I'm sure that's why they picked it. So from lipids, especially triglycerides, you can break those down. And I don't remember how much de novo synthesis of other compounds that you can make from just triglycerides. You're still missing a lot of stuff. Triglycerides do not have nitrogen in them. And nitrogen is a pretty key component to nucleotides and proteins especially. But if there was a little bit of protein coming in at the same time, why not? Maybe they also have maybe they also breathe in nitrogen and can fix nitrogen or something crazy like that. I wouldn't put it past them. So I wouldn't say we solved how they're feeding. Yeah, I just don't like ATP. I just really don't think that they are. I'm going to put a big X through this. They are. Maybe they take up some. Maybe they take up some for some like short-term like energy boost or something like that. But I really don't see how they would be able to take in enough ATP. So one of the things is if they took just ATP from someone, you would probably get victims who looked like they had maybe something akin to cyanide poisoning. So cyanide decouples what's called the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. I think cyanide is C triple bond N. So it attacks something in the mitochondria basically making it no longer make ATP. So it no longer makes ATP, which is why it's so deadly, because it is the molecule that cells like to use to transfer energy within them when they're not storing it. And people who have cyanide poisoning, they don't look dried out. They don't look old at all. So, I keep going back and forth on it. I'll put ATP in parentheses. Maybe they also take some of that. I just don't see how they could also, get a sufficient supply of nucleotides. And we store carbohydrates, but not really in anywhere in any amount that really makes sense to me at the moment to really just get at. If they can get their energy from other sources, I don't think they need that. But yeah, no life force on this list. If it came down to electrical potentials in neurons or something, that's just salt gradients. I don't think they're stealing just salt. That would be sad. So yeah, I wouldn't say we solved what the Wraith are. That. Yeah. Yeah, so this has been my first stream with more than just myself on. Thank you all for watching. I planned for 2 hours vaguely, and I've ended an hour and 15 minutes into it. Or I could end, unless there are other people who want to ask questions or start a discussion in the comments. Because otherwise, that's all I had. I'm tapped out on on my thoughts about at least Wraith biology. They have a whole another thing with their ships being grown. That's something I'd like to talk to someone who is on the same Star Trek Discord as me. Hopefully sometime we'll talk about maybe the physics of that and the biology of that. So I'm not going to touch their weird living ships. Paul says, thank you so much for the knowledge and insight. This was great. I learned a lot and it was fun speculating on my favorite show. Well, yeah, thanks for watching. I'm definitely going to... So my plan is for now on Wednesdays, if I'm not talking about something maybe real and biology related, to do some more speculative biology stuff. Stargate, Star Trek, both up there for me. I did not talk about the Goa'uld. I also have ideas on how the Goa'uld work as a society and as a genetic structure. So one of these days I'll schedule sort of talking about them. And the Asgard. We can talk about how absolutely screwed the Asgard are, what the hell they've done to themselves, and probably why they can't fix it, even though I feel like they just aren't as clever as they think they are, because they should be able to fix it. It's kind of their fault that they went extinct. And I don't even feel that bad for them by the end of it. They basically, based on what they say in the show, I think they just did everything wrong. Tell us about the drug corn casa. I don't remember this. What is casa? It is a chalk marker supply store. Stargate. Late SG1. Space Corn or Evil Orville Redenbacher. Oh, okay. Interesting. Looks similar to corn on Earth, but it has a pink purplish color rather than yellow. That's some interesting... yeah, maybe for another day, but that's... Well, the wiki page is not that long. We can talk about it. Saying it looks similar to corn, but is pink/purplish instead of yellow, really centers what Europeans like to eat as corn as like, oh, this is normal. Anything that isn't yellow is clearly not corn. Can't possibly be from Earth. Even though I'm pretty sure all the heirloom varieties of corn are basically not yellow. Anyways, engineered to be a psychostimulant. Highly addictive to anyone. It's been a while. I do not remember this one. I'll have to go back and watch this. I don't see why you can't do that. Here, let's do it right now. I'm going to erase all this. No one cares. Here, let's design an experiment. This is really easy to do. This is frighteningly easy to do. Okay, so all we need are a couple things. Let's say that we know of a gene. This is huge. Let me redo that. Come on. Okay. So let's say we have a gene. And this gene comes from fungi. I don't know how to spell it, but let's say that this is psilocybin. That is absolutely not how you spell it. I don't know how psilocybin is made, but it is a hallucinogen that is made by nature, right? It's probably not one gene, but I'm sure in the entire galaxy, you can track down a plant that makes something that is highly addictive, psychostimulating, and comes from one gene, right? So we have this. So that's easy. So we can purify this out, the gene. This is how we represent genes, where it's just like this little box. It lives on the DNA, so that's, to the left and right, that's just the rest of the DNA. And we can purify it. We can just kind of get this all by its lonesome. Okay, so we got that. And now we have our first time chat. Psilocybe. Is that how you, I don't know. We're just going to call it, actually, let's just call it psycho for psychostimulant. Because we're just making this up. So anyways, you get this, you purify this. You can do this via something called PCR, invented in like the 70s. Very, very easy. If we assume that all the organisms in the galaxy that we care about have DNA like we do, well, then that's easy. It doesn't matter what planet it came from. Next up, you get your space corn. Okay, so we got space corn, we've got this, and then we can probably either using what's called a gene gun, which shoots DNA particles, gold particles, which are covered in DNA, or find something like agrobacterium. So it's a little bacteria guy. I think it has cilia. Those attack corn here, so maybe they attack space corn too. Okay, so we got a couple components, and then we use this wonderful thing called CRISPR. Okay, so now we have all of our components. Now we design our psychogene to on the left and right hand sides of this in another color. They said the corn, the space corn, is purple, so I'll kind of use a purple color. We modify it so that on the left and right hand sides of a circular piece of DNA, it has the same genetics as the purple space corn. And then we kind of add these two together, the CRISPR and this. We put those into these bacteria, if that's how our method, or maybe a gene gun, and then we expose it to our space corn. And now, if we've done something smart, we will have space corn DNA, right? It has its own space corn genes. They're kind of hanging out doing whatever they need to do, left and right. But then in the middle of all of this, what we've gone and done is, if we've, done our science correctly, we can have inserted our psychostimulant gene, which I've already spelled wrong. Easy as that. I don't think, so this was from the Lucian Alliance. I don't think they have an FDA, so this probably didn't have to go through testing. They probably also don't have to mark it as GMO or transgenic. So making this probably was easier than you might think, as long as they knew what CRISPR was and could use CRISPR. So this came to the attention of SG1 in 2006, a couple of years before CRISPR. But safe to say that, barring something that we don't know about, you could probably actually make this. Instead of using space corn, you can use earth corn. Instead of using the psychostimulant drug, we can find something else that has probably one, maybe two genes, whether that's psilocybin. Here, I'm just going to look up psilocybin. It's found everywhere. So psilocybin is just a compound. It's going to take too long to read about what makes it. Probably going to be more than one enzyme makes that. Regardless, that's pretty close. I feel like we could have made casa. That makes sense. Was that enough detail about the drug corn casa? Like, you can make this. We can figure it out. You just have to find the right gene to put in there to make it a psychostimulant. And yeah, you can spray paint the corn pink. That'd be a good idea too. Just to make it look more spacey. Maybe after popping it in the microwave, it'd be easier to crush it up and huff it. Yeah. Anyways, on that note, I think I'm going to end a little bit early tonight. If you're interested, so on Sundays, I'm going to start doing office hours, where basically I will turn on stream. Maybe I have a subject to talk about, maybe not. But more for people who are interested to just come ask questions can come do that. On Thursdays, I'm going to be doing more of this, kind of picking out a topic, whether or not it's sci-fi related or just real science, and talk more generally about it. So yeah, thanks all for watching, and I'll hopefully see you later.